Happy Friday, readers. Today for Reading Workshop, you're going to need your Reading Interactive Notebook, your green ELA Resources folder that's inside of your anchor binder. Remember, don't take it out, just make sure you have it. And you can have a pencil and glue stick. From your green folder, you're going to take out the last teaching page that was in there from our Stop, Drop, and Roll night. Close your green folder because you have new teaching pages that you'll be placing inside once your parent picks up from the new supply pickup. You're going to take out your teaching page, and then we're going to have our notebooks. So we're going to turn back to yesterday's reading strategy lesson where we had talked about determining importance. You were asked to complete page 29 on your own during your independent work and then submit a picture to myself. So we're going to go ahead and move on to page 30. And we're going to not glue this in quite yet because we have some work to do on it because it's going to become a flip book. So we're going to first turn back to our table of contents to insert the reading strategy we're going to focus on today. So for this particular lesson, we said we are started on page 30. And today we are going to be making connections. So we have been starting this unit earlier in the week, talking about some of the reading strategies that will help us better understand our text. So we first started with our visualization or envisioning pictures or movies that were being created by the author's words. We had asking questions we might ask ourselves before we start reading, during our reading, or after, based on what the author's providing in the words or illustrations. Making predictions that are grounded in the text, so using our text to help us predict what might happen next with our characters or the plot. And then yesterday we focused on the determining importance, being able to kind of sift through the different details the author provides to focus on what's the most important for us for our understanding of the theme or the lesson. So today we're going to continue on with our trying to better understand our text from the author by making connections. So turn back to where page 30 is going to be located. And as I said, we're going to be doing some work with it first. So you need a pair of scissors as well. And on the dotted lines, there are two that you're going to cut. Be very careful to make sure that when you cut, you stop at the bolded lines. So you don't cut all the way through. You're just making yourself a door. So only do that twice. And then you can put your scissors away. Just like we've done before, you need to go ahead and then pre-fold it so we can fold it backwards just to kind of give ourselves a starting door, and then do that with all three of the doors. And that also just ensures that you have your margin that we're going to use to actually glue into the notebook. So then you can turn it over, use your glue stick only along this little stripe of the strip of paper right here. And then you can put your glue stick away, turn it over. I always line it up to the red margin that's already placed there in my notebook. That way it's nice and straight. So today we're going to be working on how to better understand our text by making connections. And on our teach page today, we're going to be using three specific types of connections that help us with our understanding. We're going to learn about how can we make a connection from the text that we're reading to ourselves. How can we make a connection from the text to another book or text that we've read? And then the last one is how can we make a connection from our text that we're currently reading to something that might be happening in the world around us. So before we get started with filling in our teach page, you have an anchor chart that is attached to your lesson today of how do we use our schema. We said this is a word that also means our background knowledge. How do we use that background knowledge to make those connections? So we think of this kind of like a target. So the outside target is what's bigger than ourselves. So how can we make those connections to the world? And then around it gives us a little bit more understanding. So it says thinking of the big ideas, themes, and or the world around me. So things that you might hear going on in your school or on the news, or just think conversations that you and your family are having. Then as we get a little closer, how can we make those connections from the text to another text that we've read? So thinking of other text or media that that we have read in the past. So a story that your teachers read to you, something that you've read in independent reading time or in a previous year, maybe something your mom or a family member have read. And then the last connection that we talk about is how can we make these connections to our everyday life? So thinking of our own lives and what has happened, our experiences are our greatest connection. And then we say the text is the heart of all of it because we base everything on our experiences. And just like we've done in the past, we think of sentence stems that we can use to have our accountable talk with reading. So we might start with a conversation that reminds me of, I can relate to, or I have a schema for, I'm remembering, or I have a connection to. Those are all great sentence stems that we can begin our accountable talk when we say that we've made those connections. So now moving back to our teaching today, we have to think about how our past and experience helps deepen our understanding of new information. So when I look at one of my most favorite read alouds that I have done in the past, this book is called The One and Only Ivan. And when I think about this book, and the reason why I first chose it is because of my son, Lawson. And I told you that I call him my little itty bitty. He is my youngest. And when he was born, he was small and he was in our NICU and he had 3 open heart surgeries. So we always thought of him as this precious little miracle that we had, but he looked kind of like a gorilla. He had the hair just like Turk did in the Tarzan movie, and we always associated everything with him to be a little gorilla. So when I first saw this book and I saw the gorilla, it gave me that connection of, it reminded me of my son, who was so precious to me. So that was the first thing that sparked my interest. But as I read this to my students in class, I grew and I fell in love with the characters and the connections that they have because of the relationship they had between themselves. So we oftentimes take the text that we're reading and we start making those connections to deepen our understanding. So it might begin by looking at a title that reminds you of someone that you care about. It might be looking at the picture that reminds you of a situation that you've been in. But those connections help us begin to make those deeper understanding of what we're about to read. And then we're able to grow those ideas as we read a little bit further. Today we're going to be reading a story, another story by Chris Van Allsburg that we talked about. This is during our author study. So we'll talk about this book in just a moment, but we want to make sure we're prepping our page to help us with the understanding of how to make connections with the story. So before we start, we're going to go ahead and fill in the information to the side. To make it a little easier, I'm going to turn so you can go ahead and follow Mrs. Ling. So the title of the story is called The Misadventures of Sweetie Pie. So you might have to double layer that. And then the author, we said, was Chris Van Allsburg. So go ahead and record the information. And we need to remember that our goal today is for us to continue practicing these reading strategies to help us with our comprehension of the text, but we're focusing on how we're going to make those connections. So it says when you make connections, you make meaning, and we want to underline that. So we make meaning from the text. You can make connections between the text and the self, text and another text, and then the text and the world around you. So we have some words missing for our closed notes that we're going to fill in before we do the work with our read aloud. So the first point that will help us focus on how do we make these connections to ourselves is, what does this, and we're filling in the word, remind me of in my life? The next one is, how is this different or the same from my life? We're going to fill in the word life. The next part is, what were my feelings? So these are all things that deal with our own selves when I read this, and what have I learned? So moving from making those connections to our personal life, we're going to then make our connections to other text or other books that we have read. So the first question that's going to help us make those connections is, how is this text the same to, and then we have other things I've read. The next one is, how is this different from other books, is the next word I read. So we can look for those similarities and the differences. So we're going to underline those two words to help us with being able to track our connections. And then the last one, the text to the world, our first guiding question says, what does this remind me of in the, and then the two words that are missing is real world. The next part is, how is this text the same to things that happen in the real world? So once again, looking for those similarities. And then the last one is, how is this text different from things that happen in the real world? So as we're reading, we're going to be thinking of how can we connect to the text and the words the author is giving us based on our schema that has related in our own lives, things that we've read previously, or things that are happening in the world around us. As we're reading, you're going to open up each door and you can jot down those connections that you have. Because this is a personal connection to either yourself, things you personally have read or have been read to, and then the things that you've heard, Mrs. Lang is not going to jot down things for you to copy. These are going to be your own thoughts and your own ideas. And after we read, you're going to take a picture of the front and underneath your doors to share with Mrs. Lang so I can see those connections that you've made. So we're going to go ahead and start by reading The Misadventures of Sweetie Pie. Remember that in all Chris Van Allsburg books that they have the illustration of the dog Fritz secretly hidden in one of the illustrations. So be a detective and be on the lookout for that character somewhere in a book, in one of those illustrations in the book. The Misadventures of Sweetie Pie. He's so cute, squealed the pigtailed girl. The hamster had heard these words before. He'd once shared his home with a dozen friends. One by one, they'd all been taken away. He'd been left behind because whenever a child had picked him up, he'd squirm and scratched. Today, he did not put up a fight. Wherever his friends had gone, he wanted to go there too. He left the pet shop and saw for the first time the great outdoors. It was filled with sunlight and endless blue sky, with smells he'd never smelled and wind he'd never felt. In his new home, Pigtails held him constantly, asking over and over, "Aren't you my little sweetie pie?" Since it was the only time he was let out of the small cage, he pretended to like it. One afternoon, Sweetie Pie awoke to find that his cage had been moved. Something else rested in its place. Pigtails sat in front of it for hours at a time. The girl didn't ignore him completely, though. Each morning, she dropped extra large handfuls of food into his bowl. Because it was so tasty and because he had nothing else to do, he ate every bite. Many days passed this way until Pigtails brought a friend to meet Sweetie Pie. "Kind of big, isn't he?" the boy asked, holding an animal that felt more like a water balloon. "Yeah," agreed Pigtails. "He eats too much, but he's lots of fun to play with. Is it a big deal?" The boy handed over a few wrinkled bills and picked up the cage. For the second time in his life, the hamster felt the wind in his fur and smelled the great outdoors. He breathed in deeply, but was back inside before he exhaled. The boy put the cage beside his bed and left the room. Sweetie Pie heard a loud sniffing sound. The cage began to shake and then crashed to the floor. Sweetie Pie, his peanut-sized heart pounding wildly, dug out from under the wood chips and found himself facing a snarling dog. "No, Buster!" The boy ran back in the room. "He just wants to be friends," he explained to Sweetie Pie, pulling the dog away. Over the next few weeks, Buster came into the room again and again, knocking the cage to the floor and banging his wet black nose against the wire bars. Sweetie Pie was too nervous to eat and had bad dreams about mad dogs. He awoke from one of them when he felt his cage tilting again. This time it was the boy carrying him to the front porch. A car stopped in front of the house. A young girl jumped out and ran up the porch steps. "Can I hold him? Can I hold him? Can I hold him?" she asked. Cousin Sue clutched the hamster as if he were a fistful of candy. Then she carried him away. At home, Cousin Sue couldn't wait to play with her new pet. She grabbed Sweetie Pie and yanked his bony paws through the sleeves of a pink dress. "Aren't you pretty?" Sue asked, and then dropped him into the dollhouse. He spun like a top, making a terrible mess. "That's not polite," she said, and tossed him back into his cage. Sweetie Pie spent the day chewing his way out of the dress. He just finished when Cousin Sue returned. "Look, I got a present for you." She twisted a plastic ball open, stuck Sweetie Pie inside, and ran out the door. When Sue put the ball on the sidewalk, the nervous hamster clawed wildly. He shot along the sidewalk, picking up speed as he raced downhill. And then there you go. There you see him. In front of the cars. Pay close attention to what we might be seeing in the window. The ball landed in a pile of leaves. Exhausted, Sweetie Pie waited for the girl to rescue him, but she never came. The sun set and the moon rose. The lonely hamster spent the night staring at the stars, wondering if he'd ever get out of his plastic prison. In the morning, he saw children playing nearby. He pawed frantically and threw himself against the ball. Slowly, it began to tilt and then rolled off the pile of leaves. Sweetie Pie steered himself toward the children. When the ball came to a stop at her feet, a little girl picked it up. "Look," she said, "it's a hamster. I always wanted one of these, but my mom says no." She gazed at the hamster longingly. "I'm keeping him." At home, she snuck Sweetie Pie into her room, opened the ball, and put him in a shoebox. When her mother called, she left. Sweetie Pie's nose began to twitch. The hungry hamster smelled food. He climbed out of the box and followed the scent to the kitchen, where the girl sat eating. As he crossed the room, he heard a loud shriek, and then bam! Something hit the kitchen floor behind him, and a rush of air sent Sweetie Pie tumbling under the table. Remember, readers, as you are listening to the story, I want you to be making those connections to, has something like this occurred in your own life? Something that you remember with your schema? Something that you've read in another book, or that you listened to in another book? And do you have any connections to the world around you based on what you're listening to? Make sure you're taking notes underneath the flap doors. "A rat!" the girl's mother yelled, raising her broom for another blow. The girl dropped to the floor to rescue Sweetie Pie and begged to keep him. "Not in this house," her mother answered. The next day, the girl took Sweetie Pie to school, where he became the class pet. Each morning, a different group of children would feed him and play with him, but when class began, he went back into his cage. He spent the rest of the day watching the leaves fall and the squirrels running through the trees. Occasionally, one of the bushy-tailed animals came and sat on the windowsill. The squirrel watched closely as the children opened and closed the cage. The hamster wondered if the squirrel was laughing at him. A silly little animal turned into a plaything for children. When holiday vacation began, Sweetie Pie left with a boy who asked to take care of him. On his way home, the boy stopped at the playground with his friends. The hamster wondered how long the boys would play. He curled into a ball. He loved being outdoors, but was not used to the cold. When he finally looked around, Sweetie Pie saw the boys had left and that something strange was falling from the sky. Before long, a blanket of white covered the wood chips in his cage. The sky got darker and the air grew colder. His teeth rattled and Sweetie Pie suddenly felt bone tired. He wished he could stop shaking. Soon his wish was granted. The hamster became still. His eyes closed and he fell into a deep and frigid sleep. After vacation, the children came back to school and saw the empty cage. The boy who'd left Sweetie Pie at the playground described with tears rolling down his cheeks how he'd run back through the snow the next morning. He found the cage with its door open and no sign of the hamster. The teacher explained that someone must have rescued him. "I'm sure," she said, "a nice little boy or girl is taking care of him." The children knew better. Their forgetful classmate probably left the cage unlatched. The hamster had escaped and was now buried under a snowdrift, frozen stiff as a popsicle. This made them very sad, but not for long. The next week, a guinea pig one of the children received for Christmas moved into Sweetie Pie's old cage. But by the time spring arrived, all the children except for one had forgotten about Sweetie Pie. The boy who'd left him outside could not stop worrying that with the snow melted, the hamster's body would be discovered. During recess, he could not keep his eyes from searching beneath bushes and dried leaves. Where could Sweetie Pie be? Had the boy looked up instead of down, he would have found the answer. High above the playground, a pair of squirrels moved quickly through the trees. They crawled into a leaf-filled hollow made warm by their friend who were nesting there. The squirrels cracked off pieces of acorn with their sharp teeth and shared the food with their small, tailless comrade. Pay close attention to the illustrations. Do we notice any kind of differences between the two squirrels? Squirrel with a big bushy tail and one without. It was not as tasty as the food he'd had when he was younger, but looking out of the nest with his friends right behind him and the children 30 feet below with no bars between him and the deep blue sky, Sweetie Pie felt like the luckiest squirrel in the tree. The end. So I want you to take a moment and finish filling out your 3 doors of your connections. Thinking about the story, look at your questions that you can answer. What does this remind me of in my life? Have you ever had the feeling of being so excited about something brand new that you've always wanted, only to lose interest and not give it the attention that it once had? How is this different or the same from life? Do you have any connections about feeling the same way that our main character of Sweetie Pie felt? What were my feelings when I read this? So how did you feel for our character when those boys and girls gave up on him and gave him to someone new? And what have I learned? What can you learn from this story or the lesson the author is teaching us? In your text-to-text, you should use these questions to help you guide. How is this text the same to other things I've read? Have you heard of a character feeling the same feeling? Have they had these misadventures, thinking that they were so excited to be somewhere new, but only to feel trapped or in a cage? And how is this different from those books I've read? And the last connection box you should be thinking of is, does this remind me of anything that's happening in the real world around us? Things that maybe you're having conversations about with your family around the dinner table. And is this the same or different from things that I have heard about that is happening in real world situations? So it could be something in your family, it could be something in your neighborhood or in your school or classroom. Think about some of the connections that you could make based on what's happening with our character. And remember, the title of our book was not The Many Adventures, it's The Misadventures. So thinking about what misadventures might mean in the context of the story. Today, for your independent work, you are not going to read on Epic, but you have another article, a story attached to your lesson. The lesson story that you're going to read to yourself is called The Oldest, the Middle, and the Youngest. So you're going to read this story. It's 1 page. And then there is a connection paper. You do not necessarily need this connection printed out, but you may if you have a printer at home. If you wanted to use just a blank piece of paper, you could make 2 columns, and you're going to be recording connections that you've made to the text. So the directions are, after reading, oldest, middle, youngest, make 2 deep connections. So not just 2 connections, but 2 deep connections. So that means that you have to provide a lot of thought and evidence with it. And write about the connections you made in the spaces below. Label those connections with the following codes. So they have 4 codes here, but you can use one of 3. So is it a text to self? You would have the T-S. You could have the text to text, so T-T. If you wanted to do the 4th optional one, is text to media. Media could be movies or the news or newspapers. And then the text to world are experiences that you heard about. Could be in the classroom or school or at a sports team. That is what we're referring to in the text to world. So read your story, thinking of 2 ways that you can make a connection. Remember, they can be something that's happened in your own life, something that's happened in another book, or something that's happened in the world around you. And I want you to write at least 2 full sentences for each connection. Remember to use complete sentences with capital letters and punctuation marks, and make sure you're including the connections that you've made. Take a picture of your connection paper and take a picture of the front of your teach page and underneath to show your own connections, and make sure you submit them today.